Alan Wake 2 is an exceptionally good game. I sincerely believe that in almost every sense it is as close to perfect as a game can get, in that it clearly achieves basically everything that it sets out to do. It won't be for everyone, because it has essentially carved out its own niche straddling survival horror and adventure games, and it does some very unique things that won't be to every gamer's tastes. Still though, it's polished, it's gorgeous, it's refined, it's balanced. It deserves to be called a masterpiece for what it does with what it's given. It gets bonus points too, because it's such a rare treat these days when any game releases in as good of a state as Alan Wake 2 did. Here's the thing though, despite his name being most of the title, it'll be pretty clear to anyone who's played the game that Alan Wake is not the central protagonist of the story, because Saga Anderson is. You'll probably play as both characters for a similar amount of time, and it's not as if Alan isn't critical to the story, but in context his sections feel more like the B-plot, or perhaps more accurately, a sort of narrative framing device for Saga's adventure. If you'd told me all that before playing, I probably would have rolled my eyes a little, given the name of the game. And yet, having finished Alan Wake 2 twice now, it doesn't bother me in the slightest, because Saga Anderson, being specifically written into the game as its hero, is actually great, and much to my surprise, I enjoyed her sections of the game more than Alan's. So much so that I started to wonder if we even need as much Alan as we do get in the game, because as much as I love him as a character dearly, I can't help but feel like he's a better narrator than he is a hero in Alan Wake 2. Alan creates Saga's journey to save himself from the Dark Place, and in the process essentially writes himself out of a lot of the best bits of that story. I think the problems I have with Alan's sections of the game are multifaceted, so I'm going to do my best to break them down in comparison with Saga's stuff. I really didn't expect to like Saga Anderson as a character as much as I did. Mostly because, like many others, I'm automatically suspicious whenever any piece of media decides to sideline its main character in a sequel or spin-off. Suffice it to say that it's not uncommon for a beloved legacy character to be dismissed or dismantled in modern media and replaced by overconfident, overpowered and often badly written new characters. I don't think that's the case here though, because Saga is legitimately great and she fits in easily into the world of the game. She's a fish out of water, but she's also one with inexplicable links to the world and the story, which evolve and change throughout the game to torment her and the player with uncertainties and revelations. She's smart, she's skilled, but she's also imperfect and troubled. She feels from pretty early on like the well-balanced, grounded character that the story needs to work. She's not ridiculously overpowered or arrogant either. She's actually remarkably likeable. And it feels weird to be complimenting that fact, given that it feels like it should be the bare minimum for any hero in any story, but it feels like a weird rarity these days. Same goes for her friendship with Alex Casey, which is a rare example of a well-written, sincere relationship between two characters who respect and like one another and work well as a team. At every stage along Saga's journey, she's a believable, sympathetic protagonist. Alan Wake as a character is just as interesting, eloquent and flawed as he was in the first game. But as a resident of the Dark Place now, he's disconnected from reality in a way which I think makes it harder to develop his character. He is necessarily living a complicated life in a confusing place where just when you think you've begun to understand something, the game flips it on its head. There are only a few characters which Alan has the opportunity to regularly interact with in his distorted version of New York, and most of those characters only serve to offer deeper levels of mystery and intrigue to Alan and the player. In a sense, Alan is driven by a fairly simple goal: to write himself out of the Dark Place. But this goal expresses itself in a way which is far less straightforward than Saga's investigations. While Saga lives out the story, Alan is experimenting and manipulating the plot, all while contending with various manifestations of the dark presence. I think it's meant to be complicated, and you have to commend Remedy for their bravery in that sense, but it makes Alan into a character who is difficult to get behind when it's difficult to even understand what is happening in his world. The two distinct worlds of Alan Wake 2 offer a great deal more variety across the length of the game than in the original Alan Wake, which I think is a very good thing. I'd be lying if I said they were both equally memorable and fun sides of a coin though, because I definitely preferred my time in Bright Falls, Cauldron Lake and Watery more than I did in The Dark Place. I have to be clear that I didn't hate the distorted version of New York, it's just that it didn't work for me on the same level as those real world locations. Obviously, the maps available to Saga are more faithful to the stuff that's in the original game, but I don't think that's why they're so great. They're significantly more interesting and fleshed out than they ever were in that game for a start, but I think what makes them so brilliant to me is actually the balance they achieve between safety and danger. All of Saga's maps in the game have areas which are essentially safe, where you can interact with characters or just take in the atmosphere. But there's also always that feeling that wherever you are, you're on the cusp of a more threatening presence. Whenever you leave a safe space, you experience this slow transition into a dangerous world where anything could jump out at you at any moment. It's a brilliantly done atmospheric shift, and then when you leave the danger and return to a safe space, there's a genuine feeling of relief. I'm not the biggest survival horror fan in the world, so maybe a feeling of constant danger is more appealing to some, but to me it's those moments of respite that make the horror so great. In The Dark Place, you do have plenty of safe spaces in the form of lit rooms where you can save your game or manage your inventory, but for the most part you're constantly moving through a world of unfriendly shadows, and it grows a little bit tiresome. It's not just that there are always threats lurking around every corner, but also that those threats are less diverse and interesting than they are in Saga's world too. You get used to the same old shadowy people in New York pretty quickly, and though there is some variety, there's nowhere near as many surprises as there are in Saga's world, where the enemies come in all sorts of terrifying shapes and sizes throughout the game. Undoubtedly, the New York map in Alan Wake 2 has some of the creepiest, eeriest locations in the game. The Ocean View Hotel and the Poet's Cinema are both very atmospheric and very well done, but because they exist in this strange ethereal state, I just found that they were less fun to explore than the locations in the real world. Coffee World, for example, had the same sort of scare factor for me as these locations in The Dark Place, but was also really fun to explore and interact with. And then there are locations like the town of Watery and the Valhalla nursing home, which are fun to explore without the constant threat. They feel like real living places where the locations in The Dark Place necessarily never can. Though that needn't have been a bad thing, I think, if they'd played it to their advantage more often. I would have liked to see more places in Alan's New York that achieved a feeling akin to the now legendary musical sequence with Mr. Door. As much as I understand the reasons for why The Dark Place is presented the way that it is, I still think it would have been more interesting, given the basically limitless opportunities they had here, to make The Dark Place even wackier with things like the Herald of Darkness, because overall The Dark Place starts to feel just a little bit too familiar by the end of the game. A good amount of the moment-to-moment gameplay in Alan Wake 2 is roughly comparable whether you're playing as Alan or Saga. They both have different weapons and tools which mixes up gameplay for the better, but for the most part, combat plays out in a pretty similar way. And that's a good thing, by the way, because the combat is almost always great, and so is the resource management and the simple but effective upgrade system. I'd argue Saga's sections of the game make the combat more naturally fun and tense because of the context and the aforementioned enemy variety. But ultimately, aside from the worlds, I think the biggest and most obvious difference in gameplay between the two characters are the boards. Alan Wake 2 features an extremely cool system which transports the player character to a room outside of the game world, recalling the much maligned Fable 3 pause menu which I always loved. Saga goes to her mind place and Alan goes to his writer's room, and in both of these locations there's a variety of things to do, but most importantly you will find a board which will play an important role in gameplay. Saga's case board allows you to arrange clues you've collected to make sense of any number of mysteries throughout the game. It's a great mechanic which rewards you as the player for figuring things out yourself, but also nudges you along just enough if you find you're in a bind. It's really integral to Saga's portion of the game, and it makes you feel like a detective in a way that no other game has ever quite managed, maybe aside from LA Noire. Alan's plot board, on the other hand, allows him to assemble events and match plot elements to locations in the game, in order to serve the story he's trying to tell. The first issue I have with the plot board, which I think on its surface seems like a really interesting idea, is that it's simply not possible to meaningfully influence the story in the game. That's just not what this game is, and I don't have any issue with that. But it's painfully obvious when using the plot board just how little you can actually achieve, and it makes it less fun to use as a result. You're basically just changing the set dressing in a small location and in a very minimal way in order to see the appropriate story beats for Alan. The other issue I have with the plot board though is that it adds a layer of complexity to the game which feels extraneous when you already have Alan's lamp, which also allows you to change the aesthetics of a small location, but without having to enter the writer's room. The lamp is a great mechanic because it's magical to see the world change around you, and I think it was best used when it was solving puzzles. But the board in most cases felt very limited and like there were only ever a few options with one obvious solution. And while the transition effect is also pretty cool for the board, the whole experience doesn't feel as gameplay focused as when you're using the lamp. I think a more advanced lamp used more often would have been more interesting here. Maybe even allowing you to change more specific objects in a scene so as to allow more tactile puzzles. Either that or no lamp and an improved plot board, but I think it works better the other way. I wanted to love both of these mechanics, and in a way I sort of do, but it just feels like they're at odds with one another a bit too often, when focusing on just one of them could have made that brilliant. Saga's case board feels like a really compelling part of the game where you're piecing things together in your head, while Alan's plot board feels kind of limited and unnecessary in the end. With everything else I've said in mind, I'd like to consider just how important Saga and Alan are to the core story itself. Now, I'm not even going to attempt to explain the intricacies of the story, because I think it's fundamentally designed to have ambiguities and raise questions which don't have obvious solutions. You can find breakdowns online that attempt to clarify the key events of the game, and the more you read or play, the more it will make sense, but I don't think it's possible to ever fully understand everything by design. To put it the simplest way I know how, though, Alan Wake spends the game contending with the dark presence as he attempts to write himself out of the dark place, while Saga, as the hero of the story, lives through the shifting reality created by Alan and Mr. Scratch in order to save him. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that, but I think by framing it that way, it becomes clear that Alan's section of the game, for as long as it is mostly world building and diversions as he loops or spirals towards a solution. That's not to invalidate any of the great stuff you discover or play through as Alan, but I only mean to say that these sections of the game are necessarily failed attempts at escape by Alan, and as a result are a little bit infuriating for the player. Not in any way bad, but simply less satisfying than playing through Saga's portion of the game, where you make tangible progress towards the ending with each chapter. I think the best way I can possibly explain how excessive Alan's sections are in the game compared to Saga's is to refer back to the original Alan Wake. Saga's role in Alan Wake 2 is directly comparable to Alan's role in the first game. She is living out a confusing story that she has little to no knowledge of, while discovering details of the mystery along the way. In the first game, it's Alan in the past who wrote that story, and in the second game, it's Alan again, except that he's writing for a different hero and going through way more drafts of the story. In essence, the stuff that Alan offers in the second game came only in the form of scattered pages and the occasional hazy flashback in the first game. I'd hate to suggest that I don't want the Alan Wake section of Alan Wake 2, because I loved it a great deal, but I do think it's interesting to consider how necessary it is to the core story. It feels like a wonderful, extremely interesting bonus, but it probably makes the story actually harder to understand in the end than it does help clarify things. At the end of the day, the story will work best for most players because Saga's journey does have plenty of concrete answers and familiar character development. There's still plenty of mystery too, but it plays from beginning to end in a fairly satisfying way. Ultimately, Alan Wake 2 offers a very complicated but clever story, which rewards the player for investigating or replaying. But it is a little obtuse at times and there are lots of loose threads. I'm just glad in the end that it's all grounded in Saga's journey. I'll mention quickly too that I really enjoyed the ending to the game, but I wish that the real ending hadn't been limited to New Game Plus. The ambiguous looping ending idea is cool but not especially satisfying for the player, and the bullet of light and a few other things aren't well explained enough that it's clear what has actually happened without the New Game Plus ending. Unfortunately, I think the reality is that a lot of people are just going to end up watching that ending on YouTube rather than replaying the game so soon after finishing it just to see it. And some are going to finish the game and never see that real ending, which just seems unfortunate. I'm not against adding cool new stuff to New Game Plus because it's nice to have those incentives for the second go around, but I just wish that it wasn't the ending in this case. If I had to summarise my issues with Alan's portion of the game, I think ultimately it comes down to stakes. As much as I try to pay close attention, and as much as the game might try to explain itself, it's not clear intuitively to the player what the stakes really are in the Dark Place. It's not obvious what life or death really mean there in the Dark Place, nor is it obvious what specifically is influencing Saga in the real world and what isn't. It seems like the vast majority of Alan's journey isn't going to have any meaningful results, and so it's more difficult to engage with his side of the story. I think connecting the spiralling story to the spiralling gameplay is clever, but in practice it leaves something to be desired. Again, I think this is largely by design, but its effect on gameplay and engagement is obvious. The Dark Place is an unfriendly and inexplicable world which doesn't really offer any sort of light at the end of the tunnel. In Saga's story, despite it being filtered through the absurdity and horror of the Dark Place's influence, it's pretty clear what the stakes are, and there's a clear forward momentum as she unravels secrets and solves mysteries. In Alan's world, though, each chapter just raises more questions. The problem, then, is that the Alan sections don't fundamentally feel like you're moving the story forward, as they do with Saga. Saga's story unfolds in such a way that I felt like every chapter I played I was being tugged deeper and deeper into the mystery. The Dark Place, on the other hand, feels so disconnected from reality that it's often difficult to connect the dots and know what you're even doing. I'll say again that I think this game is brilliant and was probably my game of the year for 2023. So I don't think anything in Alan Wake 2 is objectively bad. But I think it's because it's so good on every level that it's really open to such nuanced discussion about the story like this. If you removed the Alan Wake sections from Alan Wake 2, you would still have a very cohesive and fun survival horror experience and story. If you removed Saga's sections from the game though, and just left Alan Wake stuff, you'd have a remarkably absurd and confusing adventure which doesn't feel especially rewarding for the player. While I may have issues with the game, Alan Wake 2 is an undeniable masterpiece just the way it is. But I'd love to hear what you think. Did you prefer playing as Saga or Alan? Let me know in the comments, and please do like and subscribe if you'd like to hear me talk about more video game stuff. If you'd like to hear my thoughts on the extremely strange Alan Wake 2 Fortnite crossover and the strange state of live service gaming in general, then you should check out that video. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.